أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء وسيد المرسلين وشفيع المذنبين سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا وشفيع ذنوبنا أبي القاسم محمد والصلاة والسلام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين المنتجبين لا سيما مولانا وسيدي صاحب العصر والزمان روحي وأرواح العالمين له الفداء وأجل الله تعالى فرجه الشريف ولعنة دائمة على أعدائهم ومنكر فضائلهم إلى الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. أما بعد رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. For the hastening of the return of our 12th Imam, Imam al-Hujjah, one salawat upon Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. As we continue in these nights of Muharram, and we reach the climax of why we have been gathering over these nights, and that is obviously the night of Ashura. Tonight, as we continue in our review of the supplication that we have been going over, which has been taught to us directly by our 12th Imam, we come across again another category of individuals that the Imam is speaking to us about. As you'll recall from the previous 7 nights that we have been going over this supplication, we began by looking at qualities and characteristics which were individual, which were unique to us. So we talked about the importance of gaining knowledge, of being people who seek further knowledge of the world and also of Islam. We talked about, for example, keeping away from looking at the prohibited, about listening, keeping away from listening to things which were forbidden for a Muslim to listen to. And we looked at many of the other traits that the 12th Imam is looking for within his helpers and his assistants. As you recall from our previous few nights, we now switch attention, and rather than looking at individual qualities, we began to look at groups or segments within society that we have to be careful about, that we have to think about. And last night, as we recall, we spoke about the elderly, our parents first and foremost, which have a great right above us, and also the senior citizens in general, the elders of our community. Tonight our discussion goes to the opposite end of the spectrum, and that is the youth of the community. And how ironic is it that tonight we are marking the Shahadat of Qasim ibn Hassan, a young boy of 13 years old, who sacrificed his life on the day of Ashura as a young boy of 13. And the theme for tonight is about the youth. So before I go into it, let me just mention the line of the supplication from the 12th Imam. The Imam says in this portion, he says, وَعَلَى شَبَابِ بِالْإِنَابَةِ وَالتَّوْبَةِ. The 12th Imam is asking for something for the youth, the young men, the young women of our community should possess within themselves. Inaba and Tawbah. Now what do these mean? Before I go into that, let me mention a brief introduction or preamble to this. When we look at the period of the adolescence, of the youth, and you know it's difficult sometimes for people to put a number on how old is a youth. Does it begin at your teenage years from, let's say, 13? And if so, where does it end? At 20, 25? Where does the youth period end? I don't want to go into the semantics of the debate of how young or how old a youth should be. But without a doubt, we have a belief which the people who study the human psyche, they say that the adolescent period is a period of temporary insanity. Young men and women, they're crazy. Literally, young men and women are crazy individuals. And this is a theme which is written by psychologists, people who study the human psyche. They have this, and you can look this online. There are multiple reports and studies done that lead to a conclusion that when you're in your young days, you're literally a crazy individual. And this is not far off from the hadith, because we have a hadith from our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. in which Rasulullah has been quoted as saying, "Ash-shabab shub'atun min al-junoon." The period of your youth is a period of insanity for a young man or woman. Now what does this mean? I was looking at some articles, some research done in America about this period of the youth. What makes young men and women crazy? And they talked about the fact that when a person is born into this world, obviously as a baby, our capabilities are very limited. We can't speak. Even our eyes don't function fully. Our ears are not fully adapted to hearing sounds. And as we grow up, as we go from birth to year, and we grow and we mature physically, our brain is also developing. And scholars of the mind, scholars of the human being, they say that there's two aspects to the human mind. There is the rational component, and there is the emotional component. So we have two aspects of the physical brain as well that develop and that can grow. The rational and the emotional. These scholars say that as the human being begins to grow and develop, you get to be 13, 14, 15, 16 years old, the emotional aspect is fully, or if not fully, it is getting closer towards full maturity. But the rational aspect, which is what we need for life, the rational aspect does not begin to develop until our late 20s, early 30s. Now what does this mean for you and I, for the young men and women who are here tonight? And also for the elders, because our parents need to deal with us as we're growing up and going through this stage of adolescence, the stage of insanity, of temporary madness. They tell us that when the young man or woman is living life, those formative years are based on emotion. Whatever they do is not based on a rational justification, it's based on emotions. And you see this, and maybe you yourselves experience it, when your friends want to go do extreme sports, bungee jumping, maybe diving off of a cliff into the ocean, maybe driving at high speeds in their cars on the roads. Your rational component doesn't kick in. You don't think to yourself, if I drive 140 kilometers down this road with the limit is 60, I might get an accident. We don't think about it because we want that rush, we want that high. We want that exhilarated feeling of going fast, jumping off a building, going in a parachute, jumping out of a plane, whatever we want to do. It's very irrational, but we do it. Why? Emotions kick in, because the emotional component of the human brain is getting to be more to the level of completion. And the emotional component of our brain when we're young, it tells us, do what you want to do. Like that TV commercial, just do it. Right? The brand that people wear the shoes, just do it. We don't think about the ramifications. We don't think, what's going to happen if I'm jumping out of a plane with a parachute and something doesn't function? We don't think about when we're doing extreme sports, what will happen if I get hurt? Because we just want that adrenaline rush. We're not thinking rationally. We're using our emotional component. So when Rasulullah says that the period of the youth is a stage of insanity, it's temporary insanity. Because as we begin to grow, we become 18, 19, 20, 25, maybe we meet somebody, we get married. Now all of those things that we used to do, they seem foolish. When you get married, you're worried about your spouse. You don't want her or him to lose you and become a widow. You don't want your children to lose their parent. And so when you get a bit older, the emotions are there, but now things become more of a rational. You think about it. You won't speed on the highway or on the motorway because you know rationally what will happen if you speed. You won't maybe get into sports where you're jumping out of a plane or bungee jumping or skateboarding or BMXing because you realize from a rational perspective what will happen to you. So where or how did that shift take place? It goes back to the brain and how Allah has hardwired us. We have the emotional component as we're growing up, As we grow, as we mature, as we develop, we become more rational. We think about things. We realize that what I'm about to do might be something stupid. It doesn't make sense to jump out of a plane. It doesn't make sense to go bungee jumping. And now we change our focus in life. We begin to be more rational. But that period of the youth is what I want to look at tonight. What are the peculiarities of a young man or woman? And keeping in mind that this dua that we've been going over is something for us to try to internalize, to make ourselves ready for the time of the 12th Imam, for the Imam of our time. And again, when we look at the young martyr that we will commemorate tonight, Qasim, the son of Hassan, a young boy of 13. What would make a young boy of 13 years old when he's asked by his uncle, how do you find death? And he says, sweeter than honey. What would make a young boy think like that he's ready to sacrifice himself for the Imam of his time? And if we can learn from Qasim and his mission and his ideology and his outlook on life, then it becomes easier for you and I living in this time to ready and prepare ourselves for our Imam. And that if we are 12 or 13 or 18 or 25 and the 12th Imam's Dhuhr takes place, that we won't have to think twice about should I go and help the Imam? Should I go and assist him? Because we'll remember that young men like Qasim, like Ali al-Akbar, like Abul Fadl Abbas, that these were young men and that they were ready to give up their lives for the sake of their Imam. And so that would make it easy upon us to also go into that category. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So as I said, that the line from the 12th Imam, as he asks for the youth to have these two traits of inaba and tawbah. What is the difference between the two? The scholars who comment on this dua and the wordings that the 12th Imam has used, they say that inaba and tawbah have a very close meaning. It's similar in one way, but it's different also. Inaba, they say, is to turn to Allah. But so is tawbah. Tawbah also means to turn back to Allah. So where is the difference? The key difference between inaba and tawbah is that inaba means you turn back to Allah although you haven't performed a sin. You turn back to Allah even though you have not performed a sin. What that basically should mean for us, for the youth, I'm not really a youth, so I'll talk to the youth. What it means to the youth is that you should turn to Allah constantly in our day-to-day lives. It shouldn't just be that I do a sin, now I should turn back to Allah. Turning back to Allah, enacting inaba, means that Allah becomes the focus of our life every day. Whether I'm out shopping, whether I'm out at school, whether I'm at work, whatever I'm doing, I'm in a state of inaba. I'm always focused on Allah. Is what I'm doing something that Allah would be pleased with? Is it something that the Imam of my time would be happy for me to do? It's hard for you and I maybe to think about what the Imam would like. What does the 12th Imam want from us? Maybe we don't know this. Obviously we have to study what is the Imam looking for. What traits did the previous companions of the Imams have? And then presume that our 12th Imam would want the similar qualities within us. And so we the youth have to do our own studies, our own homework, to understand the Imams of Ahlul Bayt. What do they expect from their followers? How do we constantly be in a state of connection to Allah? You know, sometimes people think that connecting to Allah is just at those 5 times in the day. Wake up at Fajr, pray my 2 rakat, I'm connected to Allah. Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib, Isha, we continue in this way. And I'll talk about that later on. That's important, no doubt. But what is more important, because sometimes we pray without understanding. We pray without really benefiting and gaining from the salat. What's important to realize is that we need to be in a constant connection with Allah. And constant doesn't mean you take out your prayer beads and start doing the subhanallahs and Allahu Akbars. No, that's not constant connection. Constant connection is that we're always remembering Allah in the forefront of our minds. When I'm on Facebook, I'm thinking, would Allah approve for me to look at these things? When I'm on the internet and I'm going to sites maybe I shouldn't be going to, I should be thinking to myself, would the 12th Imam, if he was standing right behind me watching my monitor, would he be happy with what I'm looking at? Having consciousness of Allah means when I'm listening to things on my phone, would the 12th Imam, if he was also having a pair of headphones on and I was streaming Bluetooth to the Imam, would he be happy to listen to what I'm listening right then and there? And we know, come on, we all know. Allah tells us in the Quran, بَلِ الْإِنسَانُ عَلَى نَفْسِهِ بَصِيرًا وَلَوْ أَلْقَى مَعَذِيرًا. We know when we're committing wrong. It doesn't take the sheikh to come and say that's haram to look at. It doesn't take our mom and dad to tell us, don't look at that, don't listen to that. We know when we are not doing something. Because we have an aspect of our nafs, of our soul, that will tell us when we're doing wrong. That nafsul lawama, which is telling us, it's telling us we're doing something incorrect. And we'll feel that sometimes. You know, many times we do a sin. And it's okay if we sin, meaning that we all sin as human beings. But the real beauty is that when we sin, that we realize that we've done something wrong and we turn back to Allah. So inaba means to be in a constant connection to Allah. Every day of our lives, in the real world and in the online. And then the Imam talks about tawbah. So inaba is turning to Allah when I'm not guilty of anything. Tawbah is when I do a sin. When I break a rule of Allah, I need to realize and repent for that sin that I have performed. And it becomes difficult. It's not easy sometimes to do tawbah. It's not easy to turn back to Allah because sins, in and of themselves, by their nature, they are pleasing to do. Who can doubt the fact that to listen to the haram music is pleasing? If it wasn't pleasing, we wouldn't listen to it. But there's something beautiful in that makes us attracted to the impermissible. Looking at people of the opposite gender is something that pleases people. It's a part of human nature, but Allah has put checks and balances in place. And so when these things do happen, we need to realize that we enact this concept of tawbah, of repentance to Allah, of turning to Allah, of asking Allah for forgiveness from our actions. And when we get to that level of being people who are in a state of constant remembrance to Allah, we'll actually begin to see that tawbah will almost not even become a needed requirement because we'll already be on that straight path. We might still fall and slip and maybe perform actions which are not in line with the teachings, but more so because we're in a constant state of remembrance, we will automatically do what is right. We'll do the right thing. We'll speak the right things because we're in a constant reflection of the grandness of Allah. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allah gives us examples in the Quran of generations that are lost. You know, we have this term sometimes people talk about in English, the lost generation. A group of people of whatever religion who do not follow in the ways of their forefathers, of their parents, of their the predecessors. The Quran speaks about people who are on that path, who have lost religion, whose parents are on the good way, maybe who the first generation of believers are on the path, and then somehow they lose their direction in life, they lose their focus. Allah refers to them as this lost generation. And I'll give you just one example of the Quran. In chapter number 19, Surah Maryam, named after, as we know, the mother of Prophet Jesus, Mary, peace be upon both of them. In verse number 59, Allah presents us with a generation that becomes lost. And He gives us one of the reasons why that generation was straying away from the right path and what the outcome of this generation was. So the verse says the following. Allah says, فَخَلَفَ مِنْ بَعْدِهِمْ خَلْفٌ أَضَاعُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَاتَّبَعُوا الشَّهَوَاتِ فَسَوْفَ يَلْقَوْنَ غَيًّا. Allah says that after this generation that He's alluding to, a good, wholesome, healthy, religious, vibrant community, Allah says after them came another community, khalfun. But they were an impious community. They were people who were not following in the ways of their predecessors. They didn't inherit the right teachings. They didn't follow the teachings of their fathers, their grandfathers, their community members. And the one trait that Allah mentions is very interesting. He doesn't talk about not believing in Tawheed. He doesn't talk about shirk, about idol worship. He doesn't talk about any of the theological aspects of religion. He says that they wasted the salat, ada'u salat. Commentators of the Quran, when they look at this word, what does it mean that they wasted the prayers? They say it doesn't refer to people who didn't pray. Because one who is a tariq of salat, who doesn't pray, that's one thing. For us not to pray at all is one thing. But here Allah is saying they wasted the salat. They were praying, but they didn't care about the salat. They didn't care about knowing the importance. They didn't pray on time. That's a big challenge in our era. How do I pray on time? Many of the young men and women, you go to school, you're in the workforce, you're professionals. And sometimes the prayers come at a time when you're in school or you're at work. How do you pray? It's 1:30 or it's 12:30 and the adhan for dhuhr comes. How do you go to pray when all your friends and co-workers are going for lunch? Do you excuse yourself and go up and say, I'm going to make my prayers. I'll join you in a half an hour in the lunchroom. I'll join you for coffee in an hour or 20 minutes. And do we go and pray? Or do we just make our prayers, we miss them? And then we say, you know what, I'll come back home at the end of the night and I'll make up my prayers. You know, I remember an individual in a city that I visited many years ago. And he was a Muslim, he had a beard, he had a name, it was a religious name. So you knew he was a Muslim. And he worked for a multinational company. Now the challenge that he had is the multinational that he worked for, they also had a division where they supplied technology to the American military. So he's in a bit of a difficult situation. Muslim, practicing a Muslim name, works for a multinational that has contracts with the Department of Defense of America. So he tells me, he says, and he confesses, I didn't ask him, he says, you know what, I live an hour and a half away from work. So Fajr is, let's say, 8 a.m. or 7 a.m. I can't pray Fajr at home because I need to leave before Fajr to get to work. I said, okay, no problem. You get to work half an hour before the Fajr is finished. Do you pray at work? He says, no, I can't pray at work. I said, okay, let me hear the story. So he's there, Fajr, he doesn't pray. Dhuhr time comes, Asr time comes, he says, I can't pray, I'm still at work. I said, okay. What happens then? He says, well, Maghrib, Isha, I usually get home, so I just pray all of my prayers together at one time. Allah will forgive me, right? Well, we're not in that position to judge who's going to judge, what Allah will do. But I said, if you look at the Quran, Allah is very clear that salat has its own time. Right? Allah tells us, Inna salat kana ala al-mu'minina kitaban mawquta. The prayers are done in their time. I said, you can't tell me that in your entire building there's not a single other Muslim that works there. I said, okay, fine, you can't pray in the building. They don't have a prayer room. Why can't you go and pray in your car? If you have a minivan or a car, you can't pray standing, you can pray sitting. I said, if you can't pray sitting, there are many other options. You have many other ways you can pray. You can pray sitting on your chair. And if you need to make it up at the end of the day, do so. But there are so many options available that we don't have to make our prayers null and void. I've seen it happen that many companies will provide prayer rooms, and they call them, multi-faith prayer rooms. And I've seen it because when I worked in the corporate sector for 8 years, we had multi-faith prayer rooms, and there would be Christians, there would be Sikhs, There would be Muslims who would come and pray, meditate, whatever they wanted to do, and they'd go back to work. So we don't really have an excuse living in the West to say that we can't pray at work or at school. I'm sure every university has a prayer room. Many companies have rooms that we can pray. The point here is that we need to be punctual in our prayers. And it's difficult, I won't kid you. Allah tells us in Surah Baqarah, وَاسْتَعِينُوا بِالصَّبْرِ وَالصَّلَاةِ. Establish the prayers, or seek help rather, in Allah with the prayers and sabr wa salah, with patience and salat. But then Allah says, وَإِنَّهَا لَكَبِيرَةٌ إِلَّا عَلَى الْخَاشِئِينَ. This is difficult for people. It's something challenging to do. It's challenging to pray. Except for those who have humility, who have humbleness, who have submitted to Allah. So the verse says, فَخَلَفَ مِنْ بَعْدِهِمْ خَلْفٌ أَضَاعُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَاتَّبَعُوا الشَّهَوَاتِ. The outcome of not praying, as Allah shows it in this verse, is those people, those youth, began to follow the shahawat, their passions, their desires, their lusts. And this becomes a huge challenge, especially for the youth. Especially for youth when we live in a Western society which is the complete antithesis, it's the complete opposite of religion, where people can wear whatever they want, where there are no limits on male-female gender interaction, when we have this over-sexualized society that we live in, where we are always being stimulated by what we see around us. Allah shows us that the missing of the prayers, by delaying the salat, by wasting the prayers, by not praying at all, it leads to the outcome of our desires taking over ourselves, that we cannot control our passions anymore. Passions are something which are okay. If you look at it, when a child is born, he has a desire for the opposite gender. We all want to get married, to have a family, to have children. This is a natural desire Allah put within us. But when it goes out of control, when the shahawat take over our life, this is where the problems begin to creep up in society, and unfortunately I would even say within our communities, where we see young men and young women who openly break the rules of Allah, where the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt have allowed certain relationships to exist. Communities don't allow the young men and women for those opportunities. Many communities were told, the youth are told, don't get married till you're 25, 30, 35. Get a career, get money, get a house, and then get married. Don't get married too early. And so what happens is those shahawat, those desires, are allowed to build up and fester and are not channeled in the appropriate ways that Islam has allowed. People say, well, okay, if the boy or girl, if they're religious, then mutadayyin, they follow the religion, no problem. I would say no, that is still a problem. Because just following Islam is not the solution. Just following the religion is not the antidote. You have to follow the religion, yes, be pious, have taqwa, have piety, but where Islam has shown us that these are avenues to channel our desires, channel them in that way. It's like Allah gives us the desire for food. We all have to eat to live. If we as a community do not provide halal food, what would happen? We'd all be running to Burger King and McDonald's and KFC to get what they're offering, because we want it. If we look at it from that perspective, if we have other desires Allah has put within the youth, we can't just say, well, be pious, fast, read the Quran and you'll be helped. No, that will help. But Allah says when you're ready for marriage, as an example, get the youth married. Allah tells us in the Quran, وَأَنْكِهُ الْأَيَامَ مِنْكُمْ وَالصَّالِحِينَ مِنْ عِبَادِكُمْ وَإِمَائِكُمْ. Get the youth of the community married off, find them spouses, help them get married, provide them interest-free loans, give them a gift. Not a house, but maybe pay for their wedding expenses, help them with the furnishings. These are all things that as a community we have to think about. When we live in an era where people are spending 40, 50, 60, $100,000 on a marriage, they don't want to get married because they can't afford it. But if as a community we can pool our resources, put our money together and say if there's any youth who want to get married, we have a marriage committee. We'll help match you up with a potential spouse. You don't have money, we'll pay for the wedding ceremony. We'll pay for the honeymoon. We'll pay for whatever you need. But if we as a community are not helping one another, وَتَعَاوُنُوا عَلَى الْبِرِّ وَالتَّقْوَى, we're not helping one another, then we're going to be in a situation where we see the youth fulfilling their desires in inappropriate ways because we have not given them the right avenue to fulfill these desires that Allah has put within each and every one of us. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And on this evening, as I conclude, as we mark the death of a very young man in Karbala, a young boy who was, by all historical accounts, only about 13 years old. Maybe like some of the young boys here in the front row. Maybe a bit older than some of these young boys in the front row here tonight. The Qasim ibn Hassan, the son of Imam Hassan al-Mujtaba, our second Imam, he is ready and willing to give his life on the day of Ashura for the cause of his uncle and for obviously the cause of religion. What would make a young boy at 13 be ready to give his life for a cause? You can understand when people who were in their 80s and 90s, those companions of Sayyid al-Shuhada, when they came and told Abu Abdullah that they were ready to sacrifice, maybe it made sense. They've seen so much in life. But what about a young boy, or a young girl for that matter, because we're all within this category. What would make a young man want to sacrifice their life for a cause so noble and so important? The books of Maktal mention that Qasim, again, he was a young boy of about 13 or 14 years old. He had joined the caravan of Abu Abdullah. He joined that caravan on the night of Ashura. We're told that as all of the companions and all the men were in the tent, that Abu Abdullah gave a speech. He gave a sermon to the companions, and all the old and the older men were around Imam Hussein. And tucked away in one corner of the tent was Qasim, the son of Hassan. Qasim was in the back corner listening to Abu Abdullah speak, and he was telling the brave warriors that tomorrow is the day of Ashura. Tomorrow is the 10th. Your lives will be taken tomorrow. You don't have to be here, though. Imam Hussein tells them that the bayat is lifted off of your heads. If you want to leave, you have the right to go. They want my blood. They don't care about you. They want my allegiance. Young Qasim was in the back tent, in the back corner of the tent, listening to all of this conversation going on. He didn't say a word, but he knew that all of those men in front, that they were ready to shed their blood, to give their lives on the day of Ashura for Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. He was a bit apprehensive, but eventually after his uncle gave this sermon, he goes to his uncle Abu Abdullah and he says, "Oh my uncle, oh my dear uncle," he says, "Am I allowed to go tomorrow as well? Will you permit me to go on the day of Ashura on the 10th of Muharram to give my life for your sake as well?" The historians say that Abu Abdullah had no words. He was silent, a man of eloquence, a man of power when he spoke. But when this young 13-year-old boy came to him, he couldn't say a word to the young Qasim. Instead, Abu Abdullah puts a question to Qasim. He wants to test him. Is he really ready to give his life tomorrow? Is he really willing to sacrifice his life for the Imam of the time? And Imam Hussein says to him, he says that, what do you find, or how do you see death? What is your opinion of death? And he says to him, he says, "Oh uncle," he says, "Oh my dear uncle," he says, "I find it sweeter than honey. I find death to be sweeter than honey." That was the response that Sayyid al-Shuhada was looking for. When he heard that from this young Qasim, he realized that he was ready to battle on the day of Ashura. Eventually the day of Ashura dawns, the sun rises on the 10th of Muharram in Karbala. And as we know, the young brave warriors make their way one after the other. And one after the other, as they fall and as they leave this world, They let out that last greeting to Abu Abdullah. Eventually young Qasim comes and it's his turn to give his life. One of the historians mentions that one of the peculiarities of the day of Ashura is that any time a companion or family member would want to go to the battlefield, they would come to Abu Abdullah. They would pay their respects. They would say, Assalamu alayka ya Abu Abdullah. Peace be upon you, O Abu Abdullah. Do you give me the permission to go forward? And this was a tradition that every companion, every warrior would do. They would ask permission from their Imam. Young Qasim comes, the 13-year-old boy comes to Abu Abdullah. He greets his uncle. He asks him, he says, do you give me permission to go to the battlefield, O my uncle? And what can Hussein say? He looks at young Qasim, and we're told by the books of Makta that he takes a hug. He hugs young Qasim, he goes down and he begins to hug his young nephew. They begin to shed tears as they embrace one another. Imam Hussein realizes that he can't say no to Qasim, that Qasim has it within him. He wants to be there to represent his father, Imam Hassan, on the day of Ashura. Eventually, as Qasim is given that authority, that permission to go, we're told that as he was such a young boy, that Imam Hussein helps him to get up onto his horse. We can only picture this young boy going on top of the mount. They say the sword that he had was obviously too big. The sword was meant for an older man. They say that the people who were going to the battle, they had helmets on their head. But Qasim, being such a young boy, none of the helmets would fit him. They say that even the armor, when the older men would go to the battlefield, they had armor on their body. Qasim, being so young, there was no armor that would even fit his young body. Even the shoes, warriors would go with boots into the battlefield. But young Qasim had just a pair of slippers on his feet. In this way, brothers and sisters, Imam Hussein takes young Qasim, he mounts him on top of the horse, and he tells him to go forth in the way of Allah. Even though he was a young boy of 13 years old, the historians mention that he goes into the battlefield, and with that sword he begins to cut down to the enemy forces. He kills tens of individuals. Eventually a point comes where he becomes tired. He hasn't had food, he hasn't had water. He's been outside in the heat for so long. He takes a pause as he's sitting on top of his horse. The enemies see that this is an ideal opportunity. The writer from the side of Umar ibn Asad, Hamid ibn Muslim, he narrates that he says, I see this young boy on top of the horse. He says, Hamid ibn says that I look at this young man, his face is glowing like the moon, like a bright moon on a full moon night. He says, I'm looking at him without proper military fatigues on. And he says, I'm looking at him and I notice that his sandals, his left sandal, the strap is fallen off. As he's making note of all of these issues about Qasim, we're told that an enemy soldier comes forth and he begins to attack the young Qasim. He attacks young Qasim from the back. We're told that young Qasim falls onto the ground. Immediately the enemy forces begin to circle around Qasim. The writers of Maktal mention that at least 100 soldiers begin to gather around Qasim. They begin to gather around this young boy of 13 years old. As he's falling off his horse, he lets out a cry to his uncle. He says, Assalamu alayka ya Abu Abdullah, adrikni ya Amma. Come to my rescue, oh my dear uncle. We're told that Abu Abdullah gets on and he runs towards the battlefield. He gets towards where young Qasim is, but there's still an enemy who's about to behead the young Qasim. As Imam Hussein makes his way, he clears the enemy ranks. And as the dust begins to settle, the writers of history mention that they see Imam Hussein has the head of young Qasim in his lap. He's holding the young Qasim. Imam Hussein begins to speak to young Qasim. He says, oh my dear nephew, I'm so sorry that as the son of my brother, that you called me for help, that you called me for assistance, and I couldn't be there to be there for you. I couldn't make it in time to help you. And now that I see you in this state, that I'm here, but there's no way that I can help you. وَسَيَعْلَمُ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا أَيَّ مُنْقَلِبٍ يَنْقَلِبُونَ إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. Ya Allah, we ask you by the right of Fatima and her father and her husband and her two sons. Ya Allah, we ask you by the right of Qasim ibn Hassan that you accept this act of worship from us tonight. We ask you, Ya Allah, for all the young men and women in this community, that we are all given the ability to follow in the footsteps of Qasim and the family of the Ahlul Bayt. We ask you, Ya Allah, to allow us to see the dhuhr of our 12th Imam, and that we can be worthy of being amongst the helpers and assistants and adherents to our 12th Imam. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد.